I'm Ben Ryman, and this is Behavior Speak. Hey everybody, this spring I attended the third annual Trauma-Informed and Applied Behavior Analysis virtual conference hosted by Bay Path University and organized by Dr. Gabby Morgan. It was a fantastic conference that featured some incredible presentations from past Behavior Speak guests like Dr. Kim Crosland, who spoke on trauma-informed ABA and foster care, and Anasha Anglad with her powerful presentation on ABA and intimate partner violence. The conference also included my friend and colleague, Métis and Cree behavior analyst Jed Ashley, who presented on trauma-informed practice through an Indigenous lens. The final presentation was the most impactful conversation I've had the privilege of witnessing since I first joined the field, entitled The Intersection of Colonization, Behavior Science, and Parenting, with Robin Williams, Wendy Toribio-Baez, and Vanessa Bethea-Miller. Three powerhouse behavior analysts in their own right who came together for something really special. Robin, Wendy, and Vanessa have created a follow-up to this incredible experience in the form of a live virtual workshop series for 6 CEUs. I am more than humbled and honored to have had the chance to interview these incredible women about their work leading up to this incredible series. And now it is my great privilege to share this conversation I had with Robin, Wendy, and Vanessa, and I hope it impacts you the way it impacted me. All right, welcome everybody.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, stoked. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge I'm producing this podcast on the territories of the Klamath, Clayus, Homolko, and Comox First Nations. As always, I'm grateful to be here. All right, let's start by some introductions. Maybe we'll start with sort of the order on my screen. Robin, tell me a little bit about yourself.
I am Robin Williams. I'm located in Central Florida. I am a Florida native, so that's pretty rare to find us that are born and raised here. I have been a behavior analyst and an educator for almost 25 years. I became a behavior analyst way in the late 80s and studied under some great folks, Dr. Patrick McGreevy, Jose Martinez-Diaz, Tom Freeman. I'm a wife. I'm a mom, and I own Simplified Behavior, which is my consulting practice for behavior and education. I love Thai food and Outcasts, if that's anything else you want to know.
That's awesome. Right on. Someday I'll ask you some more questions about why there's no Florida natives. Wendy, you're next.
Sure. My name is Wendy Toribio-Baez. I am an educator. I am a behavior analyst, and I work in the Dominican Republic. I created a laboratory school where we work with children on the spectrum, and we provide them ABA therapy with Montessori. Fun fact, I'm from New York, and then I decided to have my family here in the Dominican Republic for reasons that we may talk about later on.
Yeah,
Thank you for
definitely.
having us.
We're gonna get into that deep for sure. And Vanessa.
Hi, yes, Vanessa here. I have been in the field for some time, very big on applications of ABA to outside populations, so juvenile justice, at-risk youth, that type of stuff. I currently own a consulting agency right now, just consulting to other agencies, helping provide behavior supports and taking a step back from practice ownership.
Nice. Good for you. So how did you all find each other? Where's that story start?
That is a good question. So I know both of these ladies in very different ways. I think I met Wendy pre-pandemic, right, Wendy? I think Wendy reached out to me through social media, and she became a mentee of mine and a friend. She's dynamic and amazing, and I supported her and we've supported each other over the last few years. And then Vanessa, I think we met pre-pandemic also, or maybe during the pandemic, through ABA task force work that you and Landria were doing.
Yes.
You reached out to me, and we have become friends and colleagues as well because of our similar interests.
Nice.
That's what I remember. I don't know what you want to add,
Yes.
Vanessa.
I was looking for a
Yes.
supervisor. And in the Dominican Republic, there are very few ABA supervisors. I was getting my certificate. So I needed a supervisor, right, for my ABA practice. And I was following Robin for a while, and I just loved her content and reached out to her and been following her lead ever since.
And Vanessa, did you and Wendy know each other at all before Robin hooked you up? Or?
No, Robin brought us together, but I love both ladies. We are very like-minded and have the same passions or similar passions. So it's really good to network and work together.
Yeah. And you're talking about the ABA task force there with Landria Seals Green. And I had Landry
Yes.
on early in the podcast, episode 57, I think, and we talked a little bit about that. Is that a thing that's still going?
So it is still it's still a nonprofit. It's still up and running, and Landry and I have been talking about getting it back going. It'll look much different, but yes.
Yeah, good. Yeah, no, there's some good stuff happening there, so it'd be great to see you folks working together. Right on. So tell me a little bit about how you all decided to start working together.
Yeah, so my friend, Dr. Gabby Morgan at BACB University, I met her at WEBA in 2020. I think it was 2020, maybe 2021. And she gave a really dynamic presentation that I had not seen at a conference talking about ABA and trauma-informed practices, specifically within early childhood settings. So I went up to her after her talk and said, I want to work with you. This is the type of work I'm interested in. I'm not seeing a lot of behavior analysts do this. And we started a working relationship. We've done a research project together, but she's also invited me to speak at her remote trauma and ABA conference. And so this past April was the third annual BAPATH Trauma and ABA conference, which is all virtual. And for the last two, she's asked me to speak on historical trauma. And when I thought about historical trauma, when she approached me for this time, I thought specifically about parenting behaviors and some of the things that I've talked about as a parent of Black children with Vanessa, with Wendy, knowing our interests and knowing how we think just about behavior. Both of these women have done extensive parent training. They have worked in educational spaces and have to deal with parents and parenting behaviors a lot. And I think we all think very deeply about our own parenting behaviors, where they come from, and our parents' parenting behaviors. And so that's when I decided to approach both of them and ask them if they would join me for a conversation just about the behavioral perspective on how Black and Brown people parent. And so that's how we got here. And it's just developed from that 50-minute talk to just a larger discussion.
Well, what are kind of some of the themes that you folks get into when it comes to sort of parenting and kind of how it connects to trauma and historical trauma? Do you have a credential with the International Behavior Analysis Organization, the Qualified Applied Behavior Analysis Credentialing Board, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, or would like a certificate of attendance for another organization? You can earn continuing education units by going to www.behaviorspeak.com, clicking on CEUs, and entering the 3 secret words. The first secret word is self.
We talk about how parenting behavior, what we see in the moment is, we talk about what we see in the moment in parenting behavior, how we have to look at it as behavior analysts, as their ontogenic and phylogenic perspectives, right? Their learning histories, and not judge as much these parenting behaviors. However, we should, as trauma-informed practitioners, understand where it comes from and find a way to help parents work through a better, or not better, but a more trauma-informed way of parenting. We can speak to our own experiences of how we were parented and how we parent. So some of our parents are either too strict or they avoid a connection. And all of that comes from generational trauma. Something really cool that I'm learning, I'm taking a course in functional developmental behavioral neuroimmunology. It's such a mouthful.
Wow.
So basically, I'm learning how experiences become biology, right? So how our past experiences are reflected in our neurology and in our immunology. And then how that neurology and immunology, that biology, shapes behavior. And those are the things that Robin and Vanessa and I talk about as we look to what we're going to do in parent training. how we're going to train, right? I'm in a Caribbean country, and Caribbean parents, I don't know if you know about Caribbean parents, but they're known to be super strict with their children. And that comes from that learning history. And now we know it's not just a social issue. It's not just a psychological issue. It's a biological issue, which is very interesting.
So what are some of the things that are happening there? That's really interesting. I want to learn more about this program another time, but biologically, like what do you mean? How does sort of historical trauma turn into biology, and what kinds of things are happening for these parents that, on that deeper level?
So there's
Yeah.
the methylation in DNA.
Right. Yes.
Right. So that is like a dimmer switch. It's not an on and off. It's more like a dimmer switch. And our past experiences, our past trauma tells our stress, our genes that handle stress, whether to soften or lighten or how much they can take, right? And what to do with that stress. And so you'll see that in the descendants of people that have gone through trauma, there's been the Great Dutch Famine. These things have been studied in those communities, that people have more autoimmune diseases. They have high blood pressure. And these things come not just their personal choices of what they're eating or what they're not eating, or if they exercise, but it's their DNA that can accept less stress than other folks. And so how that systemic oppression affects not just our ancestors, right? But it affects their children. And then that affects biologically their children. And so we that look to parent in this day and age have to think about, what are we doing to heal from that, understand it, heal from it, and help our children not have those autoimmune diseases and high blood pressure, and things like that.
One of the things I really like about how we broke down the 50-minute offering that we did for the conference and then the series is that we take a really in-depth look at systemic oppression and how it impacts our identities, right? So that's where we start, because being able to connect with how you identify helps you to see what types of privileges you may have in a colonized space, because we really stick to how colonization, we're focusing on colonization of the Americas and how that impacts behavior, values, beliefs, all of that. And so we believe that that starts with identity, and that comes from several books we've read and our own deep study on identity, and Kimberly Crenshaw and The Wheel of Intersectionality. We get into that very deeply. But once you are able to identify with what types of privileges you may have or what types of oppression you may be living in, then we believe it's easier for you to then think about, well, this is why I behave in a certain way. So for example, if I am a parent who has historically lived under an oppressive system that says that I have to speak a certain way or move in a certain way, when I have young children, I'm going to emphasize those ways to speak and those ways to move and those ways to be, because it becomes more of a survival. This is how you survive in this environment. This is not necessarily what I may believe is even best for you, but it is for survival. And so I love that we start with really looking deeply at identity and then moving from there to talk about different parenting styles based on identity and how that's related to different setting events and different motivating operations and even different past contingencies of reinforcement. So, yeah, I just wanted to say that.
All right. Talking about epigenetics as well, we talk about how those markers travel down, and then also bringing up, we're going to go a little bit deeper into post-traumatic slave syndrome and just this ideology of how that trauma affects us in today's world as well.
I haven't heard that term before. I mean, it seems obvious kind of what it is. Can you tell me a little bit more about sort of the post-traumatic slave syndrome?
Yeah, so Dr. Joy DeGroy, I hope I'm saying her name right, she came up with this concept, and she actually takes the DSM-5 and puts post-traumatic stress disorder and the slave syndrome together. But it's just the idea of how our specific trauma marks our genetics, our DNA, and how that travels from generations to generations. Certain things that occurred during slavery are still present in how Black and brown individuals parent their children, from just little things like, how they protected their children back then and how that looks today, right? How are we engaging in some of the same behaviors to ensure that we're protecting our children from society and what could happen to them? And it just talks about like even how we communicate with our children stems from that trauma that has been carried through us by generation and generation, just how it maps that whole system and how we operate today still under those stressors.
I'd like to add something. So an example of how we communicate with our children would be, we could be very authoritarian with our children. You're going to do this because I said so. I'm the parent, you're the child, and this idea of, well, the child has a say, at least I know, in my experiences, I know that that's a very difficult thing to see in our communities. And it's not because we don't want the best for our children, but it's because we do want the best for our children.
You get it?
You see what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
Because of our historical
Yeah.
learning histories, right? So what Robin was saying, our learning histories shape that we will protect our children. And sometimes that means that we are the harsh ones on our children in order for society not to be the harsh ones, in order to prep them for that society. But what we're doing when we don't change that identity, like Robin is saying, is we're only perpetuating that stress. And that's going to be seen biologically in our children, which is why we have to inform ourselves, inform our communities, see why we ourselves parent the way we do, and do better to heal that part of our own childhoods and our own generational baggage so that we don't pass that on. And our children are free to explore their own identities and aren't forced into the identities that have been put on them.
Yeah, we just the other day, and we've all had these conversations either in our trio or me with Vanessa or me with Wendy. But just the other day, we were talking, Vanessa and I were talking about the differences in how we were parented and how we raise our children. We're all mothers. And I know for myself, I received a lot of, well, why are you doing it that way? Or why don't you just beat them?
Wow.
And I don't think that I'm the only one. I know I'm not the only one because my colleagues have experienced similar. But because we know better and because we've investigated deeply, like, well, where did that come from that you think it's okay that hitting the child is going to prevent the behavior that you don't want to see, instead of setting expectations, teaching them appropriate behavior, providing reinforcement? Where did that happen? And we know that it's rooted to the trauma they've experienced. So another thing that we talk about in the CE offering series is just our own lived stories of how we've had to investigate our own parenting, our own identities based on what we know to be effective behavior training, but also the trauma that we've experienced. I was laughing about this TikTok I saw the other day. TikTok is one of my favorite distractions lately, but I'm trying to get rid of it. But I was watching this TikTok the other day, and it was a Black man running with his son on the beach. And he's running, and you saw that one with the guy, the baby
the
wanted to
arms?
run like Sonic. Yes, he wanted to run like Sonic the Hedgehog. And
Yeah.
it's like the cutest, most endearing thing. But one of the comments I read was, this is how you allow your kid to be free. At first, the dad wanted to be like, no, don't run like that. Run like this. Do your arms like this. And the kid's like, I just want to be Sonic. I
Right.
don't need to move my arms in it. Like, why are you trying to tell me exactly how to move, do, be every single way? I think that's a result of us as Black parents having to be super aware of how we are perceived in the colonized communities that we live in and have raised our children in. And so there's a lot of discovery that happens in this process. We're aiming this for practitioners, behavior analysts, educators, parents, who want to better understand how the historical trauma they've experienced has impacted them, but also how, as a practitioner, how can I be more, beyond being aware, how can I be more sensitive? How can I incorporate best practices when I go in to meet families, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm going to find that TikTok. I just love it. But it was an aha moment. This child is able to be free because this parent has done a little bit of work and understanding that.
Yeah. Kudos to that dad, because he
Yeah.
caught himself. It's not going to, and I think it was such a beautiful way to see that. Like, we are learning and we are evolving. So our first inclination might be to correct. And just like that dad, he said, wait, oh yeah, great arms or something like that. He's like, yeah, I love your arms or something. So kudos to him for viewing that and fixing it in the moment. It was a really nice video. I mean, even I said, hey, you got to fix that kid's arms. And then the dad said, I was like, oh, right. He can run however he wants. So I thought that was a beautiful way to see that. It's not just parents. It's also teachers or practitioners. This is something that I'm working with right now with my own teachers. There's very little teacher training, or it's almost non-existent in the Dominican Republic, especially for special ed. And just observing our teachers, we've noticed that there's this authoritarian way of trying to teach a skill instead of being child-led. Like, you could still teach functional communication, but leave it up to the child to decide what it is that he wants to communicate, right? You go in there, you have a plan. This is what your plan is as a behavior analyst. You're going to target blah, blah, blah. And the reality is that if that child isn't ready for that and you're forcing it, you're probably not using best practices if you're forcing that student to do what you planned, right? And not what he feels inclined to do that day.
I get what you're saying, Wendy. I see it a lot of times when I go into schools as well, and I'm working with staff in my schools that are predominantly staff that are part of less privileged groups, maybe groups that have experienced more historical trauma. I have to work with the staff more on reframing how they perceive behavior challenges, because there's like a value placed on the behaviors. It's good or it's bad, but not necessarily an awareness of what the behavior is communicating or how that behavior might be related to traumas that the child is experiencing or what that family is experiencing. If they're homeless, or you have a child who is on the autism spectrum and has a ton of medical needs, yet you live in the shelter. So this behavior, we need to consider all these things. And so helping staff to look at that too, I think relates to what we teach in the CE series about being an aware practitioner. We even have been in the series some tools that have been created in separate work, some work that Vanessa has done with another professional, some work that I've done with educators that consult with my group, but how in the series we give tools to practitioners, one, for how to assess when there is a need to report to Child Protective Services. I know in my experience as a behavior analyst, even working and training newer, younger behavior analysts in settings where maybe they've never worked with anyone or been near anyone who's an immigrant from another country. So they may go into the home and see something that looks different than what they've experienced in their life, and they think they need to call Child Protective Services. It's not always that. And so we have a tool for that. There's also a tool that we share in the series that is how to be more culturally aware in your supervision practices and be aware of trauma and approaching supervision from the angle of understanding identity, but also then how do you design your supervision with universal design practices and trauma-informed practices in mind to be more sensitive to the needs of people who've experienced historical trauma and honor their full identity. So we feel like it's a pretty comprehensive offering that we have, but more than that, a discussion that needs to continue to be had, right? Especially with diversity, equity, and inclusion requirements going away from our board requirements, there still is a need for the conversation to go on, right? It doesn't have to be deemed that it's this type of CE credit, but it is part of what we all believe is best practice to be a good behavior analyst.
Vanessa, I'm curious about, you do a lot of work kind of outside the autism space. I'm curious how some of this comes up and applies in some of those contexts.
I think outside of I think this really shows up, especially when you're thinking about at-risk youth and just juvenile justice. Like, it starts with parenting and that trauma that, most children that are at risk have previous trauma. They have parental concerns. They have a lot of different things that make them more likely to go down this path. And I think as practitioners, I think about working in schools, right? In the school to prison pipeline, and how we penalize children, especially Black and brown children, for their behaviors. it's not just the parents, right, at home, but you also have this coming from the people that are also there to help, like the teachers and the school that's supposed to help, bring these children up. So I just think like if we can prevent trauma, right, or if we know how to address individuals from a trauma lens, we understand why some of these children might engage in certain behaviors. And it's not because, they're bad children. It's because of the life experiences that have been handed to them. So we're just really educating and supporting parents and professionals and understanding that.
One thing I like about, many things I like about what you folks are doing. First off, I just want to quick shout out to y'all. I think I've told somebody this individually, but I was at that conference, was it BAPATH, right? By far, like the best presentation I've been to in eons. Not just the content, like the content was really cool, and I'll unpack that a bit in a second. But also, I think just the way y'all presented everything was really neat, and from Vanessa and the really kind of cool tools that you've created and kind of applied there, which I know are part of this CE project. Wendy, the sheer kind of vulnerability and emotion that you kind of displayed and shared there was powerful. Like I was tearing up, and so it was really kind of impactful. That intersectionality wheel is just the coolest thing I've ever seen, as far as sort of a visual support to sort of really, intersectionality is such a well, maybe we could unpack that a bit. Tell us, folks, a little bit about what this wheel is. I know we don't have a visual here. I know it's probably going to be part of the CEUs, so folks can see more of it there, and kind of how it affects things, because it really changed the whole way I looked at identity and intersection.
Thank you so much for that. We put a lot of thought into it, and we appreciate that. The term intersectionality was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And when we think about intersectionality, I think the easiest way to say it is that we all have parts of our identity, and different parts of our identity give us different amounts of privilege, or we may experience different amounts of oppression. And so I am a woman, but that's not the whole of who I am, right? In certain spaces, my identity as a woman will be the identity that is most forefront for me. If I'm going to a women's support group, for example, it may not matter as much if I'm a Black woman. I'm a woman. That's what I'm there for. But when I'm in that women's support group, if I begin to speak about issues that I may experience as a Black person, someone who doesn't have that same overlap in identity may not really understand where I'm coming from. And so that's what we mean when we think about intersectionality. And that's the deep dive that we go into with that wheel. There are many different versions of the wheel out there. And I've seen, especially post-COVID, post-racial reckoning in America, I've seen a few behavior analyst presentations with that wheel included. However, before that, I had used that wheel in several trainings for teachers to look at and investigate specifically racist behaviors, anti-racist behaviors. It was a whole training I did with my friend and colleague, Jennifer Borelli. But we wanted to bring it into this training because it's so powerful. Many people don't consider all of the parts of their identity and where they fall in that wheel as it relates to power. And that's where the term systemic oppression comes from. We're talking about power dynamics and who's close to the power. Well, in America, it's typically white Christian men. We just have to say what it is. And so able-bodied white Christian men. And so the further and further you move away from that center of power, you experience different levels of access, of privilege, and even something that Wendy even brought up in our conversation, like being a driver. I didn't realize how that affords me privilege. Simple things like that. So yeah, I'm glad it was impactful for you, Ben. That's what we want. We want people to think differently.
Yeah, the wheel, and I was saying this to one of you individually, the wheel can be a dangerous tool as well for folks that maybe have more privilege than others. I know I remember I was kind of scoring myself as you were doing the presentation and looking where I was, and I was actually surprised. I was expecting to see me living entirely on the outside of the wheel, because the outside's where the most privilege is, right? I think sort of
the inside. The inside.
I was expecting to be all the inside then, and as I went around, I was like, yeah, I pretty much am, sort of on all levels. But then there was a couple of things in there that I didn't have, that sort of that other folks might have, and I kind of caught myself for a moment going, I'm The second secret word is identity. It's like, and in my inside voice, and it's just another opportunity to kind of, check the bias and go, yeah, no. Just because you're middle class and not upper class doesn't mean you're oppressed. And, and a couple other things in there. But, it did sort of really open my eyes when I'm thinking about other folks. Like, I agree, the driving example was great. I've got a few friends, adult friends without driver's licenses that are severely limited in sort of a lot of things they can do. I think it helps folks maybe like myself who might limit the concept of intersectionality to just these few things like gender and race and and a couple other things. And there's just so many other factors that folks kind of don't consider that can be kind of coming into play, and like intersection, a single identity is in a vacuum kind of thing. And so, I think, but it also can make it a little overwhelming, I think, for folks that maybe are newer to conversations about privilege and bias and whatnot, to sort of see all these things going on for folks. And how do you kind of approach helping the folks that maybe are coming into some of your work that haven't been, thinking about this a lot for the last few years or all their life, and then are just sort of starting to kind of go, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Can I say something real quick?
Yes.
Can you answer that question? But can I just get this out of my head real quick?
Do it.
So, Ben, it's not just how we see ourselves. It's also how society sees us. So, for instance, I'm in a doctoral program.
Yeah.
And there are times that, I'm a scholar, right? I had to work through that for myself. You are a scholar. Robin had to work me through that. You are a scholar. And there are times that I present things to my white colleagues in my classroom and it gets brushed off, right? It gets brushed off. I'm in the space. We all got there the same way, I think. And what I say, because I have to pause, because English isn't my first language, is assume that I'm not an intelligent person, right? So even though you don't have all the privilege, right? There's a part of it, which is how society sees you, right? So if I wanted to go to certain spaces, and we talk about this often, I have to dress a certain way. I have to speak a certain way. I have to, right? Where, as a white man, you might just be able to show up with your t-shirt.
Yeah.
And people would say, he's just a millionaire. So even though you're not, I don't know if you are, but even if you're not, you can pull it off.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So that's that part of it as well. That's one thing. And then the other part, you mentioned something else. No, I can't remember. Which is what's hard, right? That sometimes it's hard. And you know what? Anything that requires growth from you is going to be hard. And then what happens is that people that have been in these colonized or oppressed spaces, we're used to being resilient. We're used to dealing with the hard. We're used to saying, well, sometimes things get tough. And it's not that we want to be tough. Trust me, I want to be soft. I want to be a soft woman. But sometimes I have to be tough because of that experience. And so for those people that this is tough, as someone with experience doing difficult things, I just want to say, stick with it. Don't abandon it. Don't use your privilege to abandon the truth. Go through it. See yourself in the mirror. It's okay.
Yeah.
And that's okay. You just sit there and sit with how uncomfortable it is, because that's where your growth is. And that's what I wanted to say. But I know you asked the question, but those were
that's good.
That's what sparked for me.
That's cool.
What you were saying.
Yeah. To add, thank you, Wendy. Yeah, I was thinking we go through a portion where we're going to do some perspective taking and really looking at, how do we perspective take for someone else? How do we put ourselves in that other person's shoes? How do we grow and how do we learn? Like, a lot of things could be like, literally, if you think about a lot of situations, would you allow that to happen to your mother? Would you be okay if that happened to your child? Would you be okay if that was you? Like, right? And I'd say this all the time. Right. To all staff. It's like I worked with adults for a while. And I used to come, like, the staff would be complaining about, this parent is annoying or this is this. And it's like, well, you got to look at it from a different standpoint. How would you want someone to take care of your child if they were in this group home? Would you be okay with what is going on today in this group home if your child was here or if your mother was here or your sister or your brother? How would that make you feel? right? And a lot of times that will change your behavior right there. That will
Right.
stop you in your tracks right there.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
really, yeah, it's uncomfortable. It's hard, right? We all have privileges. I have privileges. I have to learn that amongst my own friends and the people that I interact with, the privileges that I have that they might not have. And I have to accept that privilege. And it's a part of who I am. And I'm thankful I have it. But how do I use that to help the next person or to be a good functioning member of society? And that's what matters at the
Yeah.
end of the day.
Yeah. I wanted to say too, like when I'm working with folks and teams and whatever to do this and go through this process, some things that I like to remind people, first of all, we all have biases, right? That's foundational. Our brains are built for us to have biases because it helps our brains create safety. That's how we make connections. And so we have to understand that we all have biases, and that's okay. We also have to understand that our brains can change. Once we are aware of what those biases are, we can change our brains. We're resilient. And so all of the things we learn that are uncomfortable, and I can talk best about myself. I've had to investigate a lot of my own behavior when it comes to how I parent my children, how I communicate with my husband, how I am in relationships. And where I start is with my identity, what I believe about myself as a Black woman, and how society perceives me as a Black woman greatly influences how I behave. That's the foundational part. And so if you go into it understanding that it's this kind of process of always looking at yourself as a practitioner, and then when you show up in spaces, you might ask questions like, well, I wonder how that trauma is impacting what they believe about eating. I wonder how that specific trauma is impacting what this family believes about the importance of bedtimes. I wonder how, wow, this family has been homeless, which is a type of trauma and that results from some types of oppression sometimes. This family has been homeless off and on for the last 8 months. I wonder how that impacts what these parents or caregivers believe about the importance of being clean, like personal hygiene, and their ability to maintain personal hygiene. So how am I going to use that information as a behavior analyst to support them and create programming for them and help them identify what may need to be as a part of an intervention plan? Maybe it is we're working on personal hygiene, but how am I being aware coming in of how the trauma has impacted this family's ability to address that? I think that's what I was thinking.
And in all of this, something that I've learned is that don't try to do it on your own, right? I remember calling up Robin while I was very early in my stages of self-reflection, saying, look, Robin, this is what I want to say. I know it's inappropriate, so that's step one. How do I say this? How do I say this? And Robin always got curious. Okay, well, why do you believe that? And then I would go back into my history of being from New York. And I mean, I know that you all know great things of New Yorkers, and we're all we're the sweetest people on the planet and very understanding and kind. And we use the best language in the world. And so I would call Robin and I say, Robin, please gentrify my language. Robin, coach me through this because I know this is not how I should say it. I want to say it better and I want to understand their perspective, but it's hard for me right now. And Robin would do that for me. She'd walk me through that. And so when you're doing these hard things, you don't have to do it alone. I think this is the only time in history that we've asked humans to do better on their own. Community. And don't be afraid to be human, I mean, we're human. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to say it the wrong way. And then just going back and getting curious, like Robin said, instead of getting loud, which is what I wanted to do.
That was powerful what you just said, Wendy. Like, this is the only time in human history we've asked humans to do better alone.
Yeah.
That's
Another one of my privileges is getting to do that kind of thing. How lucky I am to get to have this conversation with you three, to be able to, just a few months ago, watching three brilliant people tell me things that are just blowing my mind. And now 3 months later, I get to ask them all the questions I want. I just want to say thanks for that. I'm really grateful for this time with you. Something else that really kind of stood out for me with your presentation, which I think is really important and timely and necessary, is just kind of going back to the historical trauma stuff. I've had a lot of folks, it's June right now. It's Indigenous History Month, Native American Heritage Month down your way. They call it the other thing up in Canada. And I've had a lot of folks from different walks of life from the Indigenous community tell me a lot about kind of intergenerational trauma, and I've learned a lot about sort of how that affects people. I had this fellow on a while back, Dr. Michael Yellowbird. His work is in the neurodecolonization and the decolonization of the mind. And Wendy, everything you said just reminded me exactly what he was saying. And he's been studying a lot about how sort of looking at sort of the biology and physiology and how the body changes sort of intergenerationally. And he dives into sort of all these different realms of science, molecular biology and chemistry and physics and all these different areas. And certainly talking about intergenerational trauma and kind of how that affects the body, quite literally, but also talking about sort of, kind of whatever sort of the opposite term might be, intergenerational the growing or something to that effect. And he talks about how, particularly in sort of his tribe, mindfulness was a big part of ceremony and ritual. And the effects of intergenerational mindfulness, essentially, has literally changed the biology of a lot of these, indigenous tribes and First Nations. Their brains are just different from other brains. Intergenerational trauma has reversed a lot of that. He told one anecdote about sort of, that still happens today, it sounds like, that there are folks in his tribe as part of some sort of, I don't know if it's a coming of age or some sort of ceremonial thing. They have a practice of they go to this tree and they sit in front of this tree and they meditate on this tree for 90 straight days.
Beautiful.
And he was looking at kind of how the brain changes as a result of that. And there's just so much really. It was the first time that I had heard of sort of the biological connections to intergenerational trauma and intergenerational growth, and that there is, and they talk about, I had another guest on who talked about sort of the 7 generations of healing, and a lot of Indigenous folks believe that it'll take 7 generations to sort of heal from the trauma of sort of residential schools and all the kind of stuff that was happening back then. And a lot of these young Indigenous parents a couple that I spoke to talked about how their child is kind of like generation 3 in that change,
Wow.
and
Wow.
how we can look at it that way and kind of continue the growth sort of in further generations of sort of your children and your grandchildren and their great grandchildren and so on. I think it's really important for behavior analysts to understand that intergenerational trauma isn't just sort of a buzzword that we've been using in sort of as it relates to sort of slavery or boarding schools or whatnot, but it's an actual physiological, biological kind of thing. I'm curious, number one, maybe obviously it affected me, but what the response has been, both from your presentation, but just, in your circles or when you sort of talk about intergenerational trauma. What do behavior analysts what do they think about all that? And then sort of a part 2 is I think it's sort of easy to kind of conceptualize, abuse and some of these sort of, immediate traumas that kids have, the ACEs score or whatever, right? And think about sort of how, when there was abuse or divorce or severe trauma and how we can sort of account for that and maybe respond differently. But intergenerational trauma is something that just didn't happen right now. It may be still happening, but the effects of it still exist. What kinds of things can, behavior analysts sort of do to sort of, acknowledge it, I guess, and sort of change the way they interact with folks, knowing that definitely exists?
I think it's an awareness. I will say, to answer the first question, the feedback was great. Everyone really enjoyed the presentation. They really enjoyed, really that point. That self-reflection piece was, I think, our biggest aspect. And then the tools as well that were provided. But I think it's awareness. And, I'll say for awareness and acceptance is a few things. But I know for Black communities, like I've been having these conversations with my father and my parents growing up. Like this has been taught to me. I may not have learned a lot in school about it. I learned some, right? But this has been taught to me through my parents because it isn't far removed from them, right? They lived some of these experiences. My grandmother can tell me stories, about what she experienced growing up. And they moved from the South, my whole sides moved from the South here to the North to have a safer life. So it's lived experience, for Black and Brown communities. But I think when you're on the other side, I think there's an acceptance piece, right? I think that people are unwilling to accept the lineage or the way the world is. We see that by the erase, it wants to be erased from history, but it's acceptance, right? And true healing is accepting your part in any trauma that may have happened. Like everyone has their own role. So really breaking that down, looking in reflection. So it's getting that awareness about this being a thing, right? Because it's not taught to everybody. Everybody is not taught this. So we can't assume that they just know that this is how it is. It's not taught in a graduate course. I think we each have learned this through our own experience because we wanted to, and we wanted to build deeper and be better. So it's that, awareness and then accepting where you fall in it and how you're going to move forward.
That you shared this concept. Thank you for sharing that, Vanessa. The concept of 7 generations of healing just kind of like punched me in the gut. Because I never really thought about it like that. I'm young. I'm almost 49 years old. And my mother, who's 20 years older than me, was put in jail as a 14-year-old for sassing the dentist. For those of you who can't see me, I'm doing air quotes, sassing the dentist. My mother, who was young, 69 years old, she was put in jail. I think she was either 12 or 14. I don't want to say the wrong age. It was around that age. I think she was 14. She went to the dentist on her own in a small Florida town. And she had to repeat herself twice. She wasn't speaking loud enough. And when she raised her voice, she was put in jail. And my great-grandmother who raised her had to go pick her up. So I think about all the things that my mother has seen and experienced. Often when I think about how she has parented us and how I analyze her behavior as a grandmother, and I love my mother. She's a beautiful woman. But I also have to have difficult conversations with her sometimes about, well, Ma, that this is really the impact of you yelling and saying you're going to do this and you don't do it. So that 7 generations of healing, that really kind of like, wow, yeah, I wonder. And to your other point on intergenerational trauma, I think as behavior analysts, one of the things we hope to get professionals to start to do is look at that intergenerational trauma as like, almost like a setting event, right? Like what has been this person's history and ability to contact the type of reinforcement that they need, right? If I'm aware of different types of trauma that a family may be experiencing, and I'm looking at, I don't know, even looking at things like access to reinforcers, that is impacted by a person's ability to provide, which could be impacted by your status in life, which could be impacted by your identity and the historical trauma, oppression, racism, sexism you've experienced, whatever it is. So I think we want to help behavior analysts look at the trauma from that angle so that you can think about better how to treat it, not just it's something that this person experienced and that's it. That's a part of being a trauma-informed behavior analyst, is looking deeper into the whole individual and all of their identity that shows up.
Man, this was such a deep conversation. As soon as Ben was speaking of Dr. Yellowbird, right? I want to know so much about him and what he's studying. So if you can send that over. And a part
I
of
sent
that,
the link.
You're so fast. I love that. I love that about you. Thank you. What can behavior analysts do? The first step is being humble, because when you're humble, you're open to learning. When you think you know it all, because you're this big bad behavior analyst, you don't allow space to learn, right? I think that for me, my first step, if this is your first step, maybe you want to look into this book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. This changed my life. I think this changed my life personally. I've read this book so many times. I keep it very close. Because it's a reminder of why I'm teaching. Paulo Freire is or was a Brazilian educator, and he explains that we usually teach, look at us. He explains that we oppressed people that have been oppressed perpetuate oppressive ideologies to ourselves through self-deprecation, and to our community through violence and anger and not having patience with our, he calls them comrades, but with our community, our own community members. That's one thing. And so when they talk about Black on Black violence or things like that, one, that's a narrative that's been pushed that's not as prominent as other violence on white people, on Black bodies, because it's not, Black on Black sounds good. It sells, it takes away responsibility. And so that's one thing, right? But there is some sort of truth behind us not having patience with each other. But that comes from our oppressed mentalities, right? So there's a Dominican saying or Hispanic saying, nadie es profeta en su tierra, which means nobody's a prophet in their own land, right? So you come around, Robin comes around her family and says, I'm this amazing. Like if I went to Robin's family and I said, Robin is my mentor and she's so amazing. Her family might be like, Robin? I know if you came to my family, that's what they would say. Wendy, you sure?
Yep. My Wendy?
You sure? Because I know her. But that comes from that oppressed mentality, right? Where we can't see someone that looks like us as a leader, as healed, as this person to learn from, right? I don't know where I was going with that, but these are things that you learn in this book, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. One thing that I see here in one of my highlights, if I may read it real quick, it's on my page 67. The correct method for revolutionary leadership to employ in the task of liberation is therefore not libertarian propaganda, nor can the leadership merely implant in the oppressed a belief in freedom, thus thinking to win their trust. The correct method lies in dialogue. The conviction of the oppressed that they must fight for their liberation is not a gift bestowed by the revolutionary leadership, but the result of their own conscientización, like their own conscientización. It's in Brazilian Portuguese, so I butchered that. But basically, you want to learn, you want to be liberated, you want to know what to do, become a conscious member before you parachute into somebody's life and tell them how to do things with their family members. So that's what I would say. It begins with being humble, because if you're humble, you're willing to learn. If you know it all, automatically your brain, once you say, I'm going to learn, you will. So that's the first step.
Finally.
And I have a bunch of other ones. I have bell hooks, teaching to transgress, education as the practice of freedom, teaching community, a pedagogy of hope. Now I know this has the little star. I'm not saying I'm a communist. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that's what she put on her book.
Sure.
Just in case I am in the Caribbean. But I just want to say that it begins with getting knowledge. And if you don't believe it, look at peer-reviewed articles. In our society, we tend to not believe stories. We tend to not believe people's lived experiences. This is why we moved from the Native American or the First Peoples storytelling, like verbal storytelling, to now having to have data. Like if it's not data, it's not real, right? That's a very white thing. Like, I need this data to believe you. I need this data to see what's really happening. Or European, it's not, an indigenous person isn't really going to tell you, let me see the data on that. They're going to feel you out and they're going to say, wow, that's your experience. Yeah. And so if you don't believe narratives, go into peer-reviewed articles and see how the epigenetics says the same story. And then, because everybody has their own starting point. If that's what you like data, go get the data. It's there. And if you're more about stories, go get the stories. If you're more about experiences, come to our events, go learn about what Dr. Yellowbird is saying, and really find out more. That's what you could do as a behavior analyst. We've all done it. We've all done it here. So it's possible. And Ben, you did say something that I thought I wanted to say something about. You said that it was very impactful for you. And how do we have these conversations? The truth is, I remember telling Vanessa and Robin, do you think people are even going to, this is basic knowledge. You think people are going to know this? They're going to care? And Robin, no, people don't know this. I'm like, are you sure? Mm-hmm. Are you sure people don't know this? Because it seems pretty obvious to me. And so another part of that is sharing your stories, because it might be very obvious to us because, like Robin said, she could tell us about something that happened to her mother, but it might not be an experience that somebody outside of her circle or outside of being in the Black and Brown communities can relate to.
The third secret word is history. Well, it's a good segue. It's a good segue related to sort of some of the stuff you folks are doing. Let's get into a bit about these CEs and kind of what's happening. What's it called? And kind of break it down for me what the offerings are.
Things. The workshop is titled Exploring the Intersection of Colonization, Behavior Science, and Parenting. And then we'll have 4 modules within this. So it's going to be on every Tuesday in August from 7 to 8:30. And each one is going to be 1.5 CEUs, depending on, like, we have some ethics in there. We have some supervision towards the end. But really just diving into the background, really the why, right? Where are we at? Why? Operationally defining terms. Then we go into that perspective taking aspect and really self-reflection. Like, that's a really huge piece. And then we're going to move into ethics and really talk about punishment and corporal punishment and ethical regulations. And what does that look like as a professional, especially when you're working with individuals who may have some type of intergenerational trauma or just different parenting styles from you. And then we end with that equity in practice. So how do we guide our practitioners and supervising with cultural humility? So it's kind of like we get the background, we learn, we self-reflect, then we move through, all right, so now what, right? We got the background, we self-reflected, what actionable steps can we take and move forward?
Is this a live series, or how's it going to be?
So it will be live, and we are going to record and probably still offer it. We're still kind of figuring that out. We're developing a lot, digging deeper. I think this is just the beginning. And this is work that we're really passionate about. We want to be able to apply it to different populations, different fields, not just behavior analysts, but schools and just general parenting, right? As a parent, like, I want to be different this time around. How do I do that? How do I learn from my own history and what I've experienced, and how can I operate with my own children? So it's really for anyone, but really digging into that stuff.
And so where can people go to find it? How do they register, sign up, and do all that?
So we have a sign up link that each of us will be posting on our social medias. We're releasing it on Juneteenth, so we got a couple days. We were thinking about giving like a discount code to people that subscribe to your podcast. That way they can come at a discounted price, thanks to, you and helping us get the word out there.
Yes.
And all your supporters as well.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah. You're doing great things too. So just, you give people, you give the, I don't want to say the underserved, but you give a platform for all different topics that really we all need to hear and learn more about. And it's not just based in the same stuff we always talk about, So we appreciate that.
Thank you, Ben.
Right on. All right. Well, this is awesome. And I hope this is just the beginning, because I think there's going to be so much good stuff. I think I maybe heard one of you maybe say one of the dreams related to this might be something, maybe like a textbook or something,
Yeah.
I did say
pretty
that.
Cool. And I bet, maybe an edited textbook, because I think there's a few other voices that could probably contribute to this as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Maybe Dr. Yellowbird will come in.
Dr.
Right?
That would be
Right. I'm
amazing.
like already on his page. He does a lot of mindfulness stuff. That looks so amazing. It's so awesome. Yeah.
And he's an approachable guy. Check him out for sure. All right, folks, this was fantastic. Definitely, easily the best interview I've done yet. And I'm hoping to still reach out and have some individual chats with y'all. And we'll probably bring y'all back again for more of these conversations. This is really cool. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Yes,
Thanks,
thank
Ben.
you.
Really appreciate you.
Thank you.
All of the details of Robin, Wendy, and Vanessa's amazing workshop series can be found in the show notes of this episode. And the folks have been really kind to offer a discount code for all my Behavior Speak listeners of 20% off using the code Behavior Speak, BEHAVIOURSPEAK. That's Behavior Speak, and get a 20% discount off this great workshop series. Thanks, everybody. Here are a few episodes of the Behavior Speak podcast you might find interesting after listening to today's conversation. Episode 162, Decolonization of the Mind with Dr. Michael Yellowbird. Episode 132, Culturally Safe Harm Reduction with Rochelle Gladue. Episode 181, Indigenizing Higher Education with Dr. Robin Zape Tahola Mintorn. And episode 182, Healing the Disconnect, Culture, Climate, and Community with Dr. Emma Elliott. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please follow us on Instagram @BehaviorSpeak.